My name is Marcus Hale, and this is the story of how I learned that the most devastating revenge isn't always the loudest one. I was 42 when everything fell apart, though I suppose fell apart isn't quite accurate. It was more like a controlled demolition, precise and inevitable, with me holding the detonator the entire time without even realizing it. For 8 years, I'd been the automation engineer at Orion Flux Solutions, a telecommunications company that had grown from a scrappy startup into a mid-sized player in the industry. My official title was Senior Systems Architect, but what I really was the person who made sure everything worked while everyone else took credit for it working. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent nearly a decade making myself obsolete. Every manual process I encountered, I automated. Every repetitive task that consumed hours of human labor, I streamlined into elegant code that ran silently in the background. Customer billing that used to take a team of 6 people 3 days to process, I built a system that handled it in minutes. Inventory management that required constant oversight, automated. Payroll synchronization across multiple departments, reduced to a few lines of code that executed flawlessly every 2 weeks. I was proud of my work. Each script, each algorithm, each perfectly orchestrated data flow was like a piece of art to me. Beautiful, efficient, invisible. The best automation is the kind nobody thinks about because it simply works, day after day, year after year. But as I sat in the company's main conference room that Tuesday morning in October, watching Dylan Keats click through his PowerPoint presentation on optimizing human capital through strategic workforce reduction, I began to understand that my artistry had painted me into a corner. Dylan was our new VP of Operations, hired 6 months earlier with the kind of fanfare reserved for messianic figures in the corporate world. Harvard MBA, McKinsey background. All the right buzzwords about synergy and digital transformation. He was 34, wore expensive suits that fit too well, and had the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never failed at anything important enough to matter. The beautiful thing about what we've accomplished here, Dylan was saying, his laser pointer dancing across a slide titled Automation ROI Analysis, is that we've essentially eliminated the need for certain legacy positions. The systems now run themselves. I was sitting in the third row, nursing my second cup of coffee and watching my colleagues nod along with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some looked genuinely engaged. Others wore the glazed expression of people who'd been through too many of these presentations to care anymore. A few kept glancing at their phones, probably dealing with the small fires that always seemed to ignite when people were pulled away from their actual work for mandatory company meetings. Take our automation infrastructure, for example, Dylan continued, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. We've reached a point where the systems are so sophisticated, so self-maintaining, that we no longer need the same level of human oversight that was required during the implementation phase. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional cough. I found myself focusing on the coffee in my cup, watching the surface vibrate slightly from the building's ventilation system. It was getting cold, but I kept holding it anyway, needing something to do with my hands. Which brings me to some exciting news about our Q4 restructuring initiative. Exciting. That was the word that always preceded the kind of news that would keep people awake at 3 a.m., staring at their bedroom ceiling and wondering how they were going to explain to their spouse that they needed to start updating their resume. Dylan clicked to the next slide. Positions made redundant by technological excellence. There was my name, listed under Automation Engineering, along with 3 others from different departments. The slide was clean, professional, and absolutely brutal in its clinical presentation of our professional deaths. These roles have essentially automated themselves out of existence, Dylan said with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for announcing quarterly profit increases. The systems they built are now self-sustaining, which is really a testament to the quality of their work. They've succeeded so completely that their ongoing presence is no longer necessary. I set my coffee cup down carefully, making sure it didn't make a sound against the table. Around me, people were shifting in their seats, some stealing glances in my direction with expressions that ranged from sympathy to relief that it wasn't them. Janet from HR was taking notes, probably preparing for the conversations she'd be having later that day. We'll be implementing this transition over the next 2 weeks, Dylan continued, with full documentation handover and knowledge transfer to ensure seamless continuity of operations. Knowledge transfer. As if 8 years of building intricate, interconnected systems could be summarized in a neat little binder and handed off like a relay baton. As if the accumulated understanding of how each piece fit together, how the exceptions were handled, how the edge cases were managed, could be distilled into bullet points and flowcharts. But I didn't say anything. I just sat there, watching Dylan outline the timeline for our professional executions, thinking about the server rack in my basement that nobody at Orion Flux knew existed. You see, when you're building automation systems for a growing company, you sometimes need development environments that won't interfere with production systems. You need places to test new code, to experiment with database schemas, to run processes that might fail spectacularly without bringing down the entire operation. Most companies have dedicated development servers for this purpose, but Orion Flux had always been cheap about infrastructure spending. Use cloud instances, they'd say. Spin up what you need and tear it down when you're done. But cloud instances cost money, and finance was always breathing down our necks about expense reports and justifications for every virtual machine we deployed. So I'd done what any practical engineer would do. I'd built my own development environment. In my basement, on hardware I'd purchased myself, running on my own internet connection. It started small, just a single server to test database migrations without risking production data. But over the years, it had grown into something more substantial. PulseCore, I'd called it. It was my pride and joy. A carefully orchestrated symphony of servers and services that mirrored much of Orion Flux's production infrastructure. I used it to prototype new features, to test system updates, to run simulations of how our automation would handle increased load or changed requirements. What made PulseCore special, though, was how deeply integrated it had become with Orion Flux's actual production systems. Not intentionally, at first. It had happened gradually, organically, as I'd found ways to offload certain processes that didn't need to run on expensive corporate hardware. Authentication services, for instance. Every user login, every API call, every automated process that needed to verify its identity, they all ultimately traced back to authentication keys that were generated and managed by a service running on PulseCore. It was more efficient this way, more secure, and it reduced the load on our production servers. The same was true for our backup verification system, our data integrity checks, our automated testing suite, and dozens of other critical processes that I'd quietly migrated to my basement infrastructure over the years. Not because I was trying to create some kind of dependency or leverage, but simply because it was the best technical solution available given our budget constraints. Nobody at Orion Flux knew about PulseCore because nobody had ever asked. They saw the results: systems that worked flawlessly, processes that never failed, automation that scaled seamlessly as the company grew. But they'd never been curious enough about the implementation details to dig deeper. Which is why, as I sat in that conference room listening to Dylan explain how my position had automated itself out of existence, I found myself thinking about a very specific cron job that ran every morning at 3:47 a.m., authenticating the day's automated processes with a handshake that originated in my basement. The meeting ended with the usual corporate theater, Dylan thanking everyone for their attention, reminding us that these changes were about positioning the company for future growth, and encouraging anyone with questions to reach out to HR. People filed out in small clusters, some stopping to offer me sympathetic smiles or awkward pats on the shoulder. I appreciated the gestures, even though we both knew they were meaningless. Janet from HR caught my eye as I was gathering my things. "Marcus, could we chat for a few minutes? There are some logistics we need to discuss." I nodded, following her to one of the smaller conference rooms down the hall. The one with the glass walls and no chairs, which should have been my first hint about how this conversation was going to go. Dylan was already there, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back like he was surveying a battlefield. There was also a security guard by the door, Tom, I think his name was. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the elevator dozens of times over the years. He wouldn't meet my eyes now. Marcus, Dylan said, turning around with that practiced corporate smile. I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've contributed to Orion Flux. Your work has been instrumental in getting us to where we are today. Past tense. Everything was past tense. We're going to need to complete the transition as quickly as possible, he continued. Today, actually, we've prepared a comprehensive exit package, and Janet will walk you through all the details. We'll need you to complete the knowledge transfer documentation and hand over any company assets before you leave. I looked around the room, at Janet with her folder of forms, at Dylan with his rehearsed speech, at Tom who was probably wondering why he needed to be here for what should have been a routine HR conversation. How long do I have? I asked. We'd like to wrap everything up by 5 o'clock, Janet said, consulting her paperwork. That should give you plenty of time to document your current projects and transfer any critical access credentials. 5 o'clock, 8 years of work. And they were giving me half a day to package it up with a bow. I spent the next few hours in a kind of mechanical autopilot, going through the motions of documenting systems that couldn't be documented, explaining processes that couldn't be explained, and preparing handover notes for people who wouldn't understand them. I cleaned out my desk drawers, carefully packing my mechanical keyboard, my collection of USB drives, and the small plant that had somehow survived 5 years under fluorescent lighting. My coworkers moved around me like I was already gone, offering occasional words of support, but mostly just getting on with their day. I didn't blame them. We'd all seen enough layoffs to know that the best strategy was to keep your head down and hope you weren't next. The hardest part was pretending that I was actually transferring something meaningful. I wrote detailed documentation about system architecture and process flows. But the truth was that most of what I'd built couldn't be understood without context that took years to develop. The edge cases, the exception handling, the intricate dependencies between systems. All of that lived in my head. Or in code repositories that weren't quite as comprehensive as the documentation suggested. And then there was PulseCore, which wasn't mentioned in any documentation at all. As the day wore on, I found myself thinking more and more about those servers humming quietly in my basement, about the authentication services that nobody knew existed, about the backup systems that verified data integrity every night at 2 a.m., about the automated testing that ran continuously, catching bugs before they could impact production. Nobody had asked me about external dependencies. Nobody had inquired about off-site infrastructure. They'd simply assumed that everything they needed was contained within Orion Flux's own systems. Because why would they think otherwise? By 4:30, I'd finished everything I could reasonably finish. My documentation was as complete as I could make it given the constraints of time and the impossibility of the task. My access credentials had been revoked. My corporate laptop had been wiped and returned to IT. I carried my box of personal belongings to the parking garage, loaded it into my car, and drove home through traffic that seemed heavier than usual. Or maybe I was just noticing it more because I didn't have anywhere urgent to be. My house was quiet when I got home. My wife Sarah was still at work and wouldn't be back until after 6. I set the box down in the hallway and stood there for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of our home, the refrigerator cycling on, the subtle creak of the building settling, the distant hum of traffic outside. Then I walked downstairs to the basement. PulseCore occupied one corner of the finished basement, a collection of server racks and networking equipment that I'd assembled over the years. It wasn't impressive to look at, certainly nothing like the gleaming data centers that Orion Flux rented space in, but it was efficient and reliable. 7 servers in total, connected by a carefully planned network topology that provided redundancy and load balancing for the various services I ran. I'd spent countless hours down here, especially in the early days when I was still learning how to properly configure enterprise-grade equipment. It had become a kind of sanctuary for me, a place where I could experiment and create without the constraints of corporate policy and budget approval processes. Each server had a carefully handwritten label indicating its primary function: authentication services, database replication, automated testing, backup verification, log analysis, development environment, and monitoring. The cables were color-coded and meticulously organized because future me had learned to hate past me when I'd been sloppy about documentation. I pulled up a chair and logged into the authentication server. A few keystrokes brought up the system logs, showing the continuous stream of requests from Orion Flex's production environment. Authentication checks, API validations, certificate renewals. Thousands of small requests that kept the company's digital infrastructure running smoothly. It would be so easy to just stop answering those requests. I opened a terminal window and navigated to the Authentication Services configuration directory. The cron job that handled daily key rotation was scheduled to run at 3:47 a.m. every morning, generating new authentication tokens and pushing them to a secure endpoint that Orion Flex's systems expected to find. All I had to do was comment out a single line of code. I stared at the cursor blinking after the hash symbol I just typed, one character that would effectively sever the connection between my basement and Orion Flex's production environment. One character that would turn 8 years of reliable automation into a catastrophic failure cascade. The thing about authentication services is that they're invisible when they work and catastrophic when they don't. Every automated process, every scheduled job, every system-to-system communication depends on being able to prove its identity. Without valid authentication, nothing talks to anything else. The entire digital nervous system of the company just stops. I saved the file and closed the terminal. Then I went upstairs, opened a bottle of wine, and waited for Sarah to come home. That night, over dinner, I told her about the layoff. She was supportive in all the ways I'd expected. Angry on my behalf, concerned about our finances, optimistic about new opportunities. We talked about updating my resume, about reaching out to my professional network, about maybe taking some time to figure out what I really wanted to do next. I didn't mention PulseCore. I didn't talk about authentication services or cron jobs or the various ways that Orion Flux was still dependent on infrastructure they didn't know existed. It wasn't that I was hiding anything from Sarah, exactly. It was more that I hadn't yet decided what I was going to do about it. I went to bed that night with my phone on silent, though I found myself checking it periodically anyway. Part of me was curious about when the first signs of trouble would appear. Another part of me was still hoping that maybe I'd been wrong about the dependencies, that maybe Orion Flux's systems were more self-sufficient than I'd thought. But mostly, I just felt empty. 8 years of work, 8 years of building something I was proud of, reduced to a box of personal belongings and a severance package that would last me 3 months if I was careful about expenses. I woke up at 3:47 a.m. without needing an alarm. Old habits, I suppose. For years, I'd been subconsciously aware of when PulseCore was running its most critical processes, the way some people wake up automatically at the same time every morning without meaning to. Somewhere in my basement, servers were humming quietly in the dark. But they weren't generating authentication keys. They weren't pushing updates to Orion Flex's systems. They weren't doing any of the hundreds of small tasks that kept the company's automation running smoothly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and waited. The first sign of trouble came at 6:23 a.m., in the form of a text message from Mike Chen in IT. Hey, getting some weird authentication errors this morning. System seems to be rejecting valid credentials. Any idea what might be causing it? I read the message, set my phone back on the nightstand, and got up to make coffee. By 7:30, my phone was buzzing with notifications. Text messages, missed calls, emails marked urgent. I ignored them all, taking my coffee out to the back porch and watching the morning sun filter through the trees in our yard. Sarah left for work around 8, kissing me goodbye and reminding me that I didn't need to rush into anything, that we were fine financially for the time being, that maybe this was an opportunity to find something better. I nodded and smiled and told her I loved her, which was true even if everything else felt complicated. Once she was gone, I finally looked at my phone. 17 missed calls, 43 unread text messages, 68 emails in my personal account, forwarded from colleagues who still had my contact information. The subject lines told the story. Urgent authentication system down. Production environment compromised. Emergency. All automated processes failing. Critical. Customer billing system offline. I scrolled through them, reading enough to get a sense of the scope of the problem. It was exactly what I'd expected. A complete failure of all automated systems, cascading from the authentication service that nobody knew was running in my basement. Dylan Keats had sent 3 emails in the past hour, each more frantic than the last. The first was professional. Marcus, we're experiencing some technical difficulties that might be related to systems you maintained. Could you provide some guidance? The second was urgent. Urgent. Need immediate assistance with authentication infrastructure. Please call as soon as possible. The third had arrived just 10 minutes ago. Marcus, I understand you may have concerns about the transition process, but we have customers who can't access their accounts. Please respond immediately. I deleted them all without responding. Instead, I made another cup of coffee and went down to the basement. Pulse Core was running normally. All systems green, all services healthy. Just not talking to Orion Flux anymore. I pulled up the monitoring dashboard that showed network traffic and service requests. The graphs were telling, a dramatic drop in outbound traffic starting at 3:47 a.m., followed by an equally dramatic spike in inbound connection attempts as Orion Flux's systems tried desperately to reach services that were no longer responding. It was beautiful, in a way. 8 years of careful engineering, of building resilient and reliable systems, had created a single point of failure that nobody else understood. They'd fired the person who held the keys to their kingdom, and now they were locked outside in the cold. My phone rang. Dylan's number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Janet from HR. Voicemail. Again. Mike from IT. Voicemail. I turned the phone face down and went back upstairs. The rest of Monday passed in a blur of ignored phone calls and increasingly desperate emails. I spent the day reading, taking a long walk through the neighborhood, doing laundry, and generally enjoying the strange luxury of having nowhere to be and nothing urgent to accomplish. Around lunchtime, I drove to the grocery store and picked up ingredients for a nice dinner. While I was there, I ran into Lisa Martinez, who'd worked in customer service at Orion Flux until her department got outsourced the previous year. Marcus, I heard about what happened, she said, her voice full of sympathy. That's so unfair. You were like the backbone of that place. Were being the operative phrase. Past tense, again. Thanks. Lisa, I'm doing okay. Probably for the best, honestly. Any idea what you'll do next? Still figuring that out, taking some time to consider my options. She nodded, understanding. We'd both been through the corporate layoff experience now. Both knew the script of polite questions and optimistic responses that didn't quite mask the underlying uncertainty. Well, if you hear about anything good, let me know. I'm still looking for something stable. I promised I would, though I suspected that stable was becoming a relative concept in our industry. That evening, Sarah and I had dinner on the porch, grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, a bottle of white wine that we'd been saving for a special occasion. Being unemployed wasn't exactly special, but it felt like the kind of moment that called for good wine anyway. How are you holding up? She asked. Better than I expected, actually. I'm sure the anxiety will hit eventually. But right now I just feel relieved, I think. Relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for 8 years and finally get to exhale. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You know what this means, right? What? You get to be picky about what comes next. You get to find something you actually want to do, instead of just something that pays the bills. I smiled, thinking about PulseCore humming quietly in the basement below us, and about Orion Flux's entire digital infrastructure grinding to a halt because nobody had bothered to ask the right questions before showing me the door. Yeah, I said. I think you're right. Tuesday morning brought a new wave of increasingly frantic communications. The voicemails were getting longer, the emails more desperate. Dylan had apparently spent Monday night at the office, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to fix it. Marcus, this is Dylan. I know you're probably upset about how things went yesterday, and I understand that, but we have a major crisis here. Our entire automation infrastructure is down. Customer billing is offline. Our support ticket system can't authenticate users. We're losing thousands of dollars every hour this continues. Please, I'm asking you to put aside whatever differences we might have and help us resolve this situation. Call me back as soon as you get this. The beautiful thing about authentication failures is that they don't just stop one system, they create a domino effect that brings down everything connected to that system. Without valid authentication, the billing system couldn't access customer databases. Without customer data, the support system couldn't validate user accounts. Without working support, customers couldn't report problems or request assistance. Without billing, money stopped flowing into the company. I imagine Dylan standing in the server room at Orion Flux, surrounded by expensive hardware that was running perfectly but couldn't talk to any of the systems it needed to talk to. Like having a garage full of luxury cars with no keys. Around noon, I got a text message from an unknown number. "This is Tom from security. Dylan asked me to reach out. Can we talk?" Tom, the security guard, reduced to playing messenger between Dylan and the person they'd escorted out of the building just yesterday. The irony was almost too perfect. I didn't respond to Tom either. Instead, I spent Tuesday researching other companies in the area, reading job descriptions, and trying to get a sense of what opportunities might be available for someone with my skill set. It was a useful exercise, even though I wasn't feeling any urgency about it yet. The severance package from Orion Flux would cover our expenses for the next 3 months, and Sarah's income was enough to handle our essential bills even without my contribution. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable enough that I could afford to be thoughtful about what came next instead of just grabbing the first offer that came along. Wednesday brought a new escalation. Instead of calls and emails from people I knew, I started getting messages from external consultants and IT emergency response firms that Orion Flux had apparently hired to help resolve their crisis. "Mr. Hale, this is Jennifer Walsh from Apex Systems Recovery. We've been contracted by Orion Flux to assist with a critical infrastructure failure. We understand you were instrumental in designing their automation systems. We'd like to schedule a consultation to discuss potential recovery strategies. Our standard emergency consultation rate is $500 per hour, with a minimum 4-hour engagement. Please call us at your earliest convenience. $500 an hour. For knowledge that, 48 hours ago, they'd decided was no longer worth keeping on staff. The voicemail from Dylan that evening was different in tone from the previous ones. Less professional courtesy, more raw desperation. "Marcus, I don't know if you're getting these messages, but I hope you are. Look, I know I fucked up. I know the layoff wasn't handled well. I know you're probably angry. And you have every right to be, but we need your help. We'll pay whatever consulting rate you want. We'll rehire you at a higher salary. We'll give you whatever title you want. Just please, call me back. We're in serious trouble here." I had to admire his honesty, even if it was probably motivated more by panic than by genuine remorse. Thursday morning brought news that Orion Flux had made the local business journal. "Local tech company faces major system outage" was the headline, followed by a brief article about how a routine personnel transition had somehow resulted in unprecedented technical difficulties that were affecting customer operations. The article was carefully worded to avoid admitting any serious problems, but reading between the lines wasn't difficult. When a company's entire automation infrastructure goes down for 4 days, that's not a technical difficulty, that's an existential crisis. By Friday, the tone of the messages I was receiving had shifted again. Less begging, more legal threats. Janet from HR left a voicemail about contractual obligations regarding company property and intellectual assets. Dylan sent an email that mentioned potential liability for damages resulting from unauthorized system configurations. They were starting to realize that maybe I had something they needed, but they still didn't understand what that something was or how to get it back. They were threatening legal action against someone who, as far as their official records showed, had completed a normal knowledge transfer and returned all company property as required. The beautiful irony was that I hadn't actually taken anything from them. I hadn't stolen code or copied databases or violated any contracts. I'd simply stopped providing a service that they'd never known they were receiving. That weekend, Sarah and I drove up to the mountains for a hiking trip we'd planned months earlier. It felt good to get away from the phone and the emails, to spend time in places where cell service was spotty and the most complex technology was the GPS in our car. We talked about possibilities. Maybe I could freelance for a while, take on interesting projects without the constraints of corporate politics. Maybe I could teach, share knowledge with the next generation of engineers who were trying to build elegant solutions to complex problems. Maybe I could start my own company, build something from scratch without having to work around legacy systems and bureaucratic overhead. All of those options sounded appealing in abstract, but I wasn't ready to commit to any of them yet. The immediate future still felt too uncertain, too dependent on how the situation with Orion Flux ultimately resolved itself. Monday morning brought a surprise, a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. Marcus, this is Alana Royce. We met at the DevOps conference in Austin last year. I remembered her, CTO at Nexum Core, a startup focused on building secure, scalable automation platforms for mid-sized businesses. We'd had an interesting conversation about the challenges of maintaining complex systems as companies grew, about the tension between efficiency and reliability. Alana, good to hear from you. What can I do for you? Well, I heard through the grapevine that you might be available for new opportunities. I know this is probably terrible timing given everything that's happening with Orion Flux, but I wanted to reach out. Everything that's happening with Orion Flux. Apparently, word was getting around. I'm listening. We're looking for a lead systems architect, someone who can help us build the kind of robust automation infrastructure that scales gracefully. Someone who understands not just how to make systems work, but how to make them maintainable and transferable. Based on our conversation last year, I think you might be exactly what we're looking for. Tell me more about the role. We talked for 45 minutes. Nexum Core was growing rapidly, but they were being deliberate about how they grew. They wanted to build systems that could handle increased load without breaking, that could be understood and maintained by teams rather than depending on individual expertise. They were offering twice my previous salary, equity in the company, and, most appealingly, complete technical autonomy. No PowerPoint presentations about workforce optimization. No VPs with Harvard MBAs second-guessing engineering decisions. Just the freedom to build things the right way, with adequate time and resources to do the job properly. I'm definitely interested, I told Alana. When would you like to schedule a more detailed conversation? How about this afternoon? I know it's short notice, but we're moving quickly on this position. We set up a video call for 2 p.m., which gave me the morning to research Nexum Core more thoroughly and prepare thoughtful questions about their technology stack, their development process, and their long-term strategic goals. The call went well, really well. Alana and I had the kind of easy technical rapport that you can't fake, where we were finishing each other's sentences and building on each other's ideas. She understood the challenges I'd faced at Orion Flux without me having to explain them in detail. She'd been through similar experiences herself in previous roles. One question I have to ask, she said near the end of our conversation. What's your availability? I know you're dealing with some consulting requests related to your previous position. I'm not doing any consulting for Orion Flux, I said. My availability is immediate. Really? I would have thought they'd want you to help with the transition, especially given the technical challenges they're apparently facing. They've made it clear that my services are no longer required. Alana was quiet for a moment. Well, their loss is our gain. Are you ready to make this official? By Wednesday, I'd signed an offer letter with Nexum Core. The paperwork was refreshingly straightforward. No Byzantine legal language about intellectual property or non-compete clauses. Just a clear description of responsibilities, compensation, and expectations. Alana had also connected me with their legal team to make sure there were no conflicts with my previous employment. They were thorough but efficient. asking all the right questions about contractual obligations and potential intellectual property issues. Based on what you've described, their attorney told me, it sounds like you fulfilled all your obligations to Orion Flux. You completed the knowledge transfer documentation, you returned all company property, and you haven't violated any contractual terms. If they're having technical difficulties now, that's their problem to solve. Which was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. That same day, I finally received a message that surprised me, an email from Mike Chen in IT, sent from his personal account rather than his Orion Flux address. Marcus, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out personally because I think there are some things you should know about what's been happening here since you left. Dylan is telling people that you deliberately sabotaged company systems before you were laid off. He's claiming that you installed some kind of logic bomb or backdoor that's causing our current problems. I don't believe that for a second, because I know you and I know your work. But I thought you should be aware that this narrative is being discussed at the executive level. Some people are talking about legal action. I also want you to know that several of us have been looking for new jobs since the layoffs were announced. What happened to you could happen to any of us. And the way management has handled this whole situation has been a wake-up call. Hope you land somewhere that appreciates what you bring to the table. I appreciated Mike reaching out, both for the warning about potential legal issues and for the vote of confidence. But I wasn't particularly worried about Dylan's accusations. What could he possibly claim I'd done? That I'd sabotaged systems by not volunteering to continue maintaining them after being fired? The idea that I'd installed malicious code was laughable to anyone who understood how authentication systems worked. Orion Flux's problems weren't the result of sabotage. They were the result of poor planning and inadequate knowledge transfer. If they'd done proper due diligence before the layoffs, they would have discovered their external dependencies and made arrangements to manage them internally. But they hadn't done due diligence. They'd made assumptions, and those assumptions had turned out to be expensive. Friday afternoon, I drove to Nexum Corps' offices for an informal meet and greet with my new team. Their office was in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and the kind of open floor plan that actually worked because they'd thought carefully about acoustics and workflow. My new colleagues were a mix of experienced engineers and younger developers, all of them sharp and enthusiastic about the work they were doing. We spent a couple of hours talking about current projects, technical challenges, and the kinds of improvements they wanted to make to their development process. It felt good to be around people who were excited about building things rather than just maintaining them. There was an energy in the room that I'd forgotten was possible in professional environments, a sense that everyone was working towards shared goals rather than just protecting their individual positions. So what do you think? Alana asked as she walked me to my car afterward. I think this is going to be fun. Good, because we have big plans for where we want to take this company, and we're going to need someone with your expertise to help us get there. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. The weight of maintaining systems that nobody else understood, of being the single point of failure for an entire company's operations, was finally off my shoulders. That weekend, I went down to the basement and began the process of properly shutting down PulseCore, not out of spite or revenge, but simply because I didn't need it anymore. The servers had done their job, and now it was time to retire them gracefully. I backed up all my personal projects and development work to external drives. I documented the hardware configuration in case I ever wanted to rebuild something similar in the future. I carefully powered down each server, disconnected the cables, and began dismantling the rack configuration that had served me so well for so many years. It was oddly emotional work. Each server had its own personality, its own quirks and characteristics that I'd learned over years of monitoring and maintenance. The authentication server that ran a little hot but never failed. The database server that occasionally needed its logs rotated manually because of a bug in the automation script. The monitoring server that had predicted 3 hardware failures before they became critical. As I was wrapping cables and labeling components for storage, my phone buzzed with a new email. Dylan Keats, reaching out one more time. Marcus, I know we've had our differences, but I want to try one more time to reach an understanding. We both know that you're the only person who fully understands the systems that are currently failing. We both know that you could help us resolve this situation quickly. I'm prepared to offer you a consulting contract worth more than your annual salary was. 6 months, fully remote, your own schedule. Complete autonomy over how you approach the technical challenges. All we need is for you to help us get back online. I've also spoken with our legal team about the concerns that have been raised regarding system sabotage. I want to be clear that we're not pursuing any legal action. We understand that the current situation is the result of poor planning on our part, not malicious activity on yours. Please consider this offer. We're not just talking about money. We're talking about the livelihoods of everyone who works here. Good people who don't deserve to lose their jobs because of decisions that were made at the executive level. I hope to hear from you soon. I read the email twice, then deleted it without responding. Not out of anger, though I'd certainly felt plenty of that over the past 2 weeks. And not out of spite, though there was admittedly some satisfaction in watching the consequences of Dylan's strategic workforce reduction play out in real time. I deleted it because I genuinely didn't want to go back. Not as a consultant, not as an employee, not in any capacity. The person who had built those systems, who had cared about their elegance and reliability, who had taken pride in making everything work seamlessly, that person was gone. He'd been escorted out of the building by security 2 weeks ago, carrying a box of personal belongings and 8 years of accumulated resentment. The person I was becoming didn't want to spend his time fixing other people's mistakes. He wanted to build new things, better things, with people who understood the value of what he brought to the table before they needed him to save them from their own poor decisions. By Sunday evening, Pulse Core was completely offline. The servers were stored in labeled boxes in the garage. The network equipment was packed away. And the basement corner that had housed my personal data center was empty except for a few Ethernet cables and the ghost outlines where the server racks had been bolted to the floor. I stood there for a moment, looking at the empty space, thinking about all the late nights I'd spent down here troubleshooting problems, optimizing performance, building systems that would outlast my employment at the company they served. There was a certain poetic justice to it, I supposed. Orion Flux had decided that my position had automated itself out of existence. They'd been right, in a way, just not in the way they'd intended. Monday morning, I started my new job at Nexum Core. The onboarding process was everything that Orion Flux's hadn't been: thoughtful, comprehensive, and designed to set me up for success rather than just checking legal boxes. I spent the first day meeting with various team members, understanding their current architecture and identifying areas where my experience could add value. The technical challenges were genuinely interesting. Nexum Core was at the stage where they were outgrowing their initial infrastructure, but weren't yet large enough to justify enterprise-grade solutions. They needed someone who could build bridges between where they were and where they wanted to be. Someone who understood how to scale systems gracefully without over-engineering them. It was exactly the kind of problem I loved solving. By the end of my first week, I'd identified 3 critical bottlenecks in their automation pipeline and drafted proposals for addressing each of them. Not quick fixes or temporary patches, but thoughtful architectural improvements that would serve them well as they continued to grow. Alana was thrilled. "This is exactly why we wanted you here," she said during our Friday check-in. "You see the big picture in ways that most engineers don't. You understand not just how to build systems, but how to build systems that other people can maintain and improve." It was a nice feeling, being valued for expertise rather than just availability. Being seen as someone whose knowledge was worth preserving rather than someone whose position could be automated away. That same Friday, I got a text message from an unknown number. "Marcus, this is Jenny Walsh from the customer service team at Orion Flux. I know you probably don't want to hear from anyone there, but I wanted you to know that Dylan was fired this morning. Thought you might want to know." I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to process how I felt about this news. Vindicated, satisfied, sympathetic. Mostly. I just felt tired. Dylan's firing wouldn't restore the systems that were still offline. It wouldn't undo the damage to Orion Flux's reputation or the revenue they'd lost during 2 weeks of operational chaos. It was a symbolic gesture that might make the board of directors feel better about taking action. But it didn't actually solve any of the fundamental problems that had created the situation. I typed back, "Thanks for letting me know. I hope things improve for everyone there." Which was true, despite everything. The people who were still working at Orion Flux, the developers, the customer service representatives, the support staff, they weren't responsible for the decisions that had led to this crisis. They were just trying to do their jobs under increasingly difficult circumstances. The following Monday, I received an official letter from Orion Flux's legal department. Not a threat or an accusation, but an offer to purchase any external infrastructure or intellectual property that might be relevant to restoring normal operations. They were finally asking the right questions, just about 3 weeks too late. I drafted a polite response explaining that I didn't own any intellectual property that belonged to Orion Flux, and that any external infrastructure I'd maintained had been permanently decommissioned. I offered to provide documentation of what systems had been running where, but made it clear that the actual infrastructure no longer existed. It wasn't entirely true. I still had the backed up configuration files and could theoretically rebuild Pulse Core if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. And more importantly, I didn't want to create any expectation that I might be available to help with future technical emergencies. I was done being the person who saved other people from their own poor planning. The response from Orion Flux's attorneys was swift and professionally disappointing. They acknowledged my clarification and thanked me for my cooperation. But I could read between the lines of their carefully neutral language. They'd been hoping for a quick technical fix to their problems, and instead they were facing the much more expensive prospect of rebuilding their automation infrastructure from scratch. Over the following weeks, I heard occasional updates about Orion Flux through my professional network. They'd hired an expensive consulting firm to help them rebuild their authentication systems. They'd brought in temporary contractors to handle manual processes that had been automated. They'd lost several major customers who had grown tired of system outages and service disruptions. Most significantly, they'd been acquired by a larger competitor at a fraction of their previous valuation. The acquisition was positioned as a strategic merger, but everyone in the industry understood what it really was: a distressed sale by a company that had made a series of catastrophic operational decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Orion Flux's strategic workforce reduction had ultimately resulted in the reduction of the entire workforce through acquisition. Dylan's plan to eliminate redundant positions had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. By the time the acquisition was announced, though, I was deep into my new role at Nexum Core and barely paid attention to the news. We were working on a fascinating project to build distributed automation systems that could scale across multiple cloud providers. The kind of technical challenge that required both deep expertise and creative problem-solving. It was the sort of work I'd always wanted to do, but had never had the opportunity to pursue at Orion Flux, where most of my time had been spent maintaining existing systems rather than building new ones. The difference between reactive problem-solving and proactive system design was more profound than I'd realized. 6 months into my new position, Alana approached me about taking on additional responsibilities. Nexum Core was growing rapidly, and they wanted me to lead a new team focused on automation architecture for enterprise clients. "We're getting requests from companies that have heard about what we're building," she explained. "Mid-sized firms that are struggling with the same kinds of challenges you helped us solve. They want someone who understands how to build automation that scales gracefully. That doesn't create single points of failure." The position would come with another significant salary increase and equity options. But more importantly, it would give me the opportunity to mentor other engineers and share the lessons I'd learned about building maintainable systems. I accepted the offer immediately. Looking back now, almost a year later, I can see that getting fired from Orion Flux was one of the best things that ever happened to my career. Not because of the revenge fantasy of watching my former employer struggle with the consequences of their poor decisions, though I'll admit there was some satisfaction in that, but because it forced me to reconsider what I actually wanted from my professional life. At Orion Flux, I'd been so focused on making things work that I'd forgotten to ask whether they were worth working on. I'd built elegant solutions to problems that probably shouldn't have existed in the first place. maintained systems that served a company culture I didn't really believe in. At Nexum Core, I'm building systems that I'm genuinely excited about, working with people who share my values about what good engineering looks like. The technical challenges are more interesting. The company culture is healthier, and the compensation is significantly better. But the most important difference is that I'm no longer the only person who understands how critical systems work. Everything we build here is designed to be maintainable by teams rather than individuals. We document not just what systems do, but why they do it. We invest in knowledge transfer and cross-training because we understand that single points of failure are dangerous, whether they're technical or human. We build systems that could survive the departure of any individual contributor, including me. Sometimes I think about Dylan Keats and wonder what he learned from the Orion Flux experience. Whether he understood that the problem wasn't that he'd fired the wrong person, but that he'd created a situation where firing any individual person could bring down the entire company. Whether he realized that true efficiency comes from building robust systems, not from eliminating the people who understand how those systems work. But mostly, I don't think about Dylan at all. Or about Orion Flux. Or about authentication servers running in basement data centers. Or about any of the technical debt that someone else is now responsible for cleaning up. These days, when I wake up at 3:47 a.m., it's not because I'm subconsciously tracking critical system processes. It's because my daughter is teething and needs to be comforted back to sleep. Sarah and I had been trying to start a family for years, and the reduced stress of my new job apparently made all the difference. She was born 8 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in February. We named her Elena, and she has Sarah's eyes and my stubborn determination to understand how everything works. I've been teaching her about cause and effect lately, how pushing this button makes that light turn on, how dropping toys from her high chair makes them fall down instead of up. She's beginning to understand that actions have consequences, that the world operates according to predictable patterns that can be learned and anticipated. It's a lesson that some people take longer to learn than others. Last week, I received a LinkedIn message from someone at Orion Flux, or rather, at the company that acquired them. They were reaching out about a consulting opportunity, helping to modernize some legacy automation systems that were apparently causing ongoing maintenance headaches. I politely declined, suggesting they might have better luck posting the project on freelancer platforms where they could find someone without a potential conflict of interest. But I was curious enough to do a little research about what had happened to the company after the acquisition. The news wasn't particularly surprising. Most of the original staff had been laid off or had left for other opportunities. The Orion Flux brand had been retired in favor of the parent company's branding. The office building where I'd spent 8 years had been sold and was being converted into luxury condominiums. It was a strange feeling, realizing that the place where I'd spent so much of my professional life no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Not sad, exactly, but melancholic in the way that endings always are, even when they're endings that you wanted. I showed Sarah the LinkedIn message that evening while we were giving Elena her bath. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The technical challenge of maintaining all those complex systems?" I thought about it while Elena splashed happily in the warm water, delighted by the simple physics of cause and effect. "I miss the elegance of it sometimes," I said. "The satisfaction of building something that worked perfectly, reliably, invisibly. But I don't miss being the only person who understood how it worked." "Oh, and you don't miss the revenge aspect? The dramatic irony of them needing your help after they fired you?" I laughed. That was never really about revenge. It was about consequences. They made decisions without understanding what those decisions would cost them. I just happened to be in a position where their poor planning became very expensive very quickly. But you could have helped them, couldn't you? If you'd wanted to. Sure. But helping them would have meant enabling the same kind of thinking that created the problem in the first place. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is let people experience the full consequences of their choices. Elena chose that moment to demonstrate her understanding of cause and effect by slapping the water with both hands, soaking both of us with bath water. We laughed, and I realized that I was happier in that moment. Wet, tired, responsible for a tiny human who depended on me for everything. Then I'd been in years of professional success at a company that saw me as replaceable overhead. These days, my basement is used for storage and Elena's growing collection of toys. The server racks are gone, replaced by plastic bins full of baby clothes and a changing table that we'll probably use for the next few years. Sometimes, when I'm down there looking for something in storage, I remember the quiet hum of PulseCore running its nightly processes, the satisfaction of watching monitoring dashboards show green lights across all systems, the pride of building something that worked so well that people forgot it existed. Those were good systems, elegant and reliable and efficient. They deserved better than being treated as disposable infrastructure by people who didn't understand their value. But they also deserve to be understood and maintained by teams rather than individuals. They deserve to exist in organizations that valued the knowledge required to build them, not just the results they produced. I'm building those kinds of systems now, at Nexum Core, with people who understand that sustainable automation requires sustainable engineering practices. We're creating solutions that will outlast any individual contributor, that will continue to serve their purpose even as the team evolves and grows. And when Elena is old enough to understand what her father does for work, I want to be able to explain that I build systems that help people accomplish important things, systems that are documented and maintainable and designed to survive the inevitable changes that come with growth and time, not systems that collapse when one person walks away. That's the real lesson I learned from the Orion Flux experience. The most elegant revenge isn't dramatic or immediate. It's building something better, something that demonstrates by example what good engineering looks like when it's properly valued and supported. The best revenge is a life well lived, systems well built, and consequences naturally unfolding according to the logic of cause and effect. Dylan Keats taught me that, though I doubt he intended to. For that lesson, if nothing else, I suppose I owe him a debt of gratitude.